We're now 2 weeks past the 90-day tariff pause that paused Trump's wholesale 10% duties on EU imports. As of August 1st, the US is threatening to hit European wine, cheese and cars with up to 30% tariffs. Brussels is walking a tightrope, delaying retaliation yet preparing 72 billion to 93 billion in counter duties. Tonight we break down what that means for the supermarket shelf, the local Napa tasting room, your next lease-to-buy sedan, and ultimately, your wallet. If you've spent $20 at the wine store or financed a European car, you need to listen. The United States and the European Union are locked in one of the most significant trade disputes in recent memory, with consequences that extend well beyond corporate boardrooms and into the lives of everyday consumers. The dispute intensified earlier this year when President Trump invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, to impose a universal 10% tariff on EU imports. Initially, these duties were framed as leverage to secure better trade terms with Brussels, with the White House threatening to escalate them to 20% if negotiations stalled. A temporary 90-day pause agreed upon in early April was supposed to create space for both sides to find common ground. That pause expired on July 9th, and Washington has since doubled down, threatening to raise tariffs on European goods to 30% beginning August 1st, unless a breakthrough is reached. At the center of this dispute are products that symbolize the cultural and economic ties between Europe and the US: French wine, Italian cheese, and German automobiles. These goods have long been staples for American consumers who value European quality and tradition. Yet they are now caught in a political crossfire. A 30% tariff could push the price of a bottle of Italian Barolo or a wedge of French Brie well beyond the reach of middle-class households. For example, French wine producers are warning that their exports could decline by as much as 80% if tariffs take effect, while Italian trade groups fear that their high-end wines could vanish from US store shelves altogether. French cheese exporters have echoed these concerns, arguing that a product already considered premium will become unaffordable for many families. Automobiles represent an even larger slice of the transatlantic trade pie. The US currently imposes a 25% tariff on European car imports, particularly targeting German brands such as BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Volkswagen. If this duty climbs to 30%, the price of a mid-range sedan or SUV could increase by thousands of dollars. Dealerships in states like Ohio and Texas have reported that customers are already hesitating to commit to new purchases due to uncertainty over price hikes. For auto parts suppliers, which depend heavily on cross-border supply chains, the added cost could disrupt manufacturing schedules and squeeze already thin margins. On the European side, the stakes are equally high. The EU's trade surplus with the United States, which was approximately €157 billion in goods alone in 2023, has made Brussels a target for Washington's aggressive trade policies. EU leaders, led by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič, have worked to delay retaliation, hoping that diplomacy will avert an all-out tariff war. However, behind closed doors, Brussels is preparing a countermeasure package worth between €72 billion and €93 billion. These retaliatory tariffs would hit a wide range of US exports, including aircraft, bourbon, medical equipment, and even digital services. The 90-day negotiation window was intended to prevent such a destructive cycle of tariffs and counter-tariffs. During this period, Brussels and Washington engaged in several rounds of talks, attempting to strike a balance between American demands for a zero-for-zero tariff framework and the EU's push to protect its agricultural and industrial sectors. While some progress was made on regulatory alignment and digital trade, fundamental disagreements remain unresolved. The White House continues to demand concessions on European automotive exports and the liberalization of certain EU farming regulations, issues that are politically sensitive for European governments, particularly in France and Italy. The tone of the negotiations has grown increasingly tense. President Trump, speaking at a rally in Michigan, criticized the EU for what he described as decades of unfair trade practices, claiming that Europe has built its economy off the backs of American workers and taxpayers. In response, von der Leyen emphasized that the EU will not negotiate under threat, while still leaving the door open for dialogue. Šefčovič, the EU's chief negotiator, warned in a recent interview that the proposed 30% tariffs would effectively eliminate EU-US trade in critical sectors, putting €4.4 billion in daily cross-border trade at risk. Consumers are already feeling the early ripples of this standoff. Retailers who import European goods are stockpiling wine and cheese to avoid future price surges, but their reserves are limited. In New York, a wine store owner reported that some premium labels have already increased by 10 to 15% due to supply chain uncertainty. Grocery stores are preparing for similar price adjustments in the specialty cheese aisle, while auto dealers are bracing for a wave of cancellations if the August deadline passes without a deal. The broader economic stakes are significant. Economists estimate that a full-blown tariff war between the US and EU could reduce US GDP by up to 0.7% and shave 0.3% off the EU's economy. While these figures might appear modest, they translate into billions of dollars in lost output, potential job losses, and higher costs for consumers. Moreover, the dispute threatens to unravel one of the world's most important trade relationships, which currently accounts for more than $2 trillion in annual goods and services exchanges. In Washington, the political calculus is straightforward. Tariffs are seen as a bargaining chip that appeals to a domestic base wary of globalization. In Brussels, however, leaders are balancing the need to protect European exporters with the risk of fragmenting internal unity among member states. France and Italy, with their wine and cheese industries at stake, are pressing for a firm response. Germany, heavily dependent on auto exports, is urging caution and compromise. As the August 1st deadline approaches, all eyes are on the next round of negotiations in Washington, where Šefčovič will attempt to secure concessions before the tariffs take effect. Whether these talks produce a breakthrough or descend into another cycle of threats remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that the outcome of this trade fight will directly affect the price tags of products that many Americans consider part of their everyday lives, from the wine on the dinner table to the car in their driveway. The roots of this trade conflict stretch back years, but the current escalation is shaped by a mixture of political ambition, economic imbalance, and competing visions of global trade. At its core, this is not just about wine, cheese, or cars. It's about the leverage that both Washington and Brussels believe they need to maintain economic power in a shifting global landscape. From the US perspective, the administration is determined to reduce its long-standing trade deficit with the European Union. In 2023, the United States recorded a goods trade deficit of approximately $236 billion with the EU, much of it stemming from industrial products, luxury goods, and automobiles. President Trump has framed this imbalance as a threat to US jobs and manufacturing. During speeches and press briefings, he has repeatedly emphasized that tariffs are a tool to force fair trade and to bring production back to American soil. The narrative resonates with parts of the American electorate who feel that globalization has hollowed out domestic industries, especially in the Midwest and the South, where manufacturing jobs have steadily declined over the past 2 decades. Trump's trade doctrine is characterized by a belief in using tariffs as a blunt but effective negotiating weapon. Under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, his administration imposed a 10% universal tariff on EU imports earlier this year. The move was justified on national security grounds, with claims that heavy reliance on European steel, aluminum, and industrial components undermines US economic resilience. While the initial aim was to push Brussels toward reducing tariffs on American products, the White House quickly escalated its demands. A threat of increasing tariffs to 20% and now 30% has become central to Washington's bargaining strategy. On the other side of the Atlantic, the European Union views these tariffs as both economically harmful and politically provocative. The EU has long championed open trade, and its internal market is structured around the free flow of goods and services. Leaders in Brussels argue that the United States is using tariffs less as a tool of economic correction and more as a form of political pressure. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has stated that the EU will not negotiate under threats and has prepared a comprehensive countermeasure package valued between 72 billion and 93 billion euro, ready to target US exports like aircraft, bourbon, and even digital services. Yet, Brussels is also keenly aware that a trade war with its largest single trading partner could destabilize its own economy. The political timing of this dispute is no coincidence. With the US presidential election cycle approaching, the administration is eager to demonstrate a tough stance on trade. Tariffs play well as a domestic political message, presenting the image of a leader defending American workers against foreign competitors. Meanwhile, in Europe, governments are under pressure from powerful agricultural and industrial lobbies. French wine producers, Italian cheesemakers, and German automakers are some of the most vocal groups, warning that prolonged tariffs could destroy export markets they have built over decades. There is also a strategic layer to this conflict. Both the US and EU are vying for influence in setting global trade rules, particularly as China's economic rise reshapes international supply chains. The US wants to leverage tariffs to push the EU toward concessions in sectors such as technology, digital trade, and regulatory standards. Brussels, in contrast, is wary of being seen as capitulating to Washington's demands, especially when it has been actively pursuing new trade agreements with Asia-Pacific nations and Latin American markets to diversify its export base. Inflationary pressures add another dimension to the dispute. In the US, consumer prices have been climbing steadily, with durable goods like cars and household appliances costing hundreds of dollars more than they did a year ago. Tariffs on European imports threaten to exacerbate these trends by making popular goods more expensive. Critics of the policy argue that American consumers, not European exporters, will bear the brunt of these costs. A recent analysis from the Peterson Institute for International Economics suggested that the proposed 30% tariffs could add an average of $1,000 annually to household spending, particularly for families that purchase imported goods. In Europe, the macroeconomic situation is equally complex. The EU's economy is still recovering from sluggish growth, and many member states face high energy costs and labor market challenges. The prospect of losing access to the US market, worth over $850 billion annually in goods and services trade, is particularly alarming for industries like automotive manufacturing in Germany and luxury food exports in France and Italy. For these nations, the US is not just another trading partner. It is a critical customer base that sustains jobs and economic activity. The negotiations between Washington and Brussels have been intense but inconclusive. The US is demanding a zero-for-zero framework, which would involve both sides eliminating tariffs on certain industrial goods. However, Brussels is reluctant to open up sensitive agricultural sectors, fearing backlash from farmers who are already struggling with price volatility and climate-related challenges. Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič has been leading the EU delegation, trying to secure exemptions for key products, while also pushing back against what he calls unilateral economic aggression. Behind the scenes, there is recognition on both sides that a prolonged trade war would be mutually damaging. Economists estimate that a breakdown in talks could cost the US economy up to 0.7% of GDP and shave 0.3% off the EU's GDP. These numbers may sound small, but in real terms, they translate to billions in lost economic activity, job cuts in affected industries, and reduced consumer confidence. Supply chains, already strained by post-pandemic disruptions, would face additional friction, leading to delays and higher costs for everything from electronics to car parts. Ultimately, this conflict is as much about political signaling as it is about economic reality. For Washington, tariffs are a way to project strength and demand respect on the global stage. For Brussels, resisting US pressure is essential to maintaining its credibility as an independent economic power. The next few weeks will be critical in determining whether the two sides can reach a compromise or whether this standoff will escalate into a fully fledged trade war. The consequences of the US-EU trade standoff are cascading through multiple layers of society, from high-end car dealerships in Florida to small cheese shops in New York, and even across vineyards in Bordeaux or Parma's dairy farms. While trade disputes often appear abstract, this one is highly tangible. It affects prices on store shelves, purchasing decisions in showrooms, and even long-term investment strategies in industries that have relied on stable transatlantic trade flows for decades. US consumers at the checkout line. The most immediate and visible impact is being felt by American households. Specialty imports such as French wine and Italian cheese, once affordable luxuries, are becoming less accessible. Even before the proposed 30% tariffs take effect, some importers are preemptively raising prices to offset the uncertainty. In Manhattan, a specialty wine retailer recently reported that popular French vintages like Bordeaux and Burgundy have increased in price by 10 to 15% over the past month. Cheese counters in Chicago and San Francisco are beginning to replace European varieties like Brie de Meaux and Parmigiano Reggiano with domestic alternatives, citing rising wholesale costs. This trend isn't limited to luxury goods. Everyday grocery products that rely on European ingredients or packaging are also expected to rise in price. A bottle of mid-range Italian olive oil, which previously retailed for $12 to $14, could soon exceed $18 if tariffs go into effect. Consumers who once sought out authentic European flavors may have to choose between paying more or switching to American-made substitutes, which could, in turn, create a ripple effect across domestic producers and distributors. The auto market shockwave. No industry feels the looming impact of this dispute more sharply than the automotive sector. German brands like BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Volkswagen are mainstays of the US car market. Currently, a 25% tariff already inflates their prices, but the jump to 30% would add several $1,000s to the price of popular models. For example, a mid-sized SUV that retails for $55,000 today could easily cross the $60,000 threshold with added tariffs, pushing it beyond the reach of many middle-class buyers. Car dealerships, especially in states like Texas, Ohio, and California, where European brands are popular, are bracing for reduced sales. A dealership manager in Columbus, Ohio, recently noted that customers are postponing purchases, waiting to see if negotiations between Washington and Brussels will yield relief. Leasing options, which often depend on competitive pricing, are also expected to become less attractive as monthly payments climb. The effects are not confined to luxury vehicles. Auto parts from Europe, including components used in American assembly plants, are also subject to these tariffs, raising costs across the supply chain. Small businesses and importers. Small and medium-sized importers who lack the scale to absorb sudden cost increases are particularly vulnerable. A family-owned gourmet store in Portland, Oregon, which imports European olive oils, cheeses, and chocolates, reported that their shipping costs have already risen due to new customs surcharges. If tariffs increase, the store's owners fear they will have to reduce their product selection or raise prices so much that loyal customers turn elsewhere. Restaurants, particularly those specializing in European cuisine, are also on edge. Italian trattorias and French bistros in cities like Boston or Los Angeles are struggling to maintain menu prices when the cost of essential ingredients like cured meats, specialty cheeses, and wines is climbing. Some chefs are already experimenting with domestic substitutes, but the risk is that diners accustomed to authentic flavors might not return if the quality changes. European exporters and farmers. Across the Atlantic, exporters and farmers are facing their own crisis. Italian wine producers are warning that their US sales could drop by as much as 80% if tariffs hit 30%. For many vineyards, the American market represents a significant share of their global revenue. Losing that outlet would not only slash profits but also disrupt employment in rural regions that rely heavily on agricultural exports. French dairy farmers, known for their artisanal cheese production, are equally concerned. A surge in tariffs would make their products less competitive compared to American cheese brands, potentially forcing them to scale back production. Some smaller operations, which operate on slim margins, may not survive prolonged trade disruptions. French trade associations have begun lobbying Brussels for emergency relief or compensation if tariffs persist. Industrial and manufacturing ripple effects. The tariffs on steel and aluminum, which have already climbed to 50% under the new US trade regime, are pushing costs higher for industries ranging from construction to appliances. American manufacturers who rely on European steel for precision parts are feeling the pinch. For instance, companies producing kitchen appliances or high-end cookware are warning of price hikes as they pass on these costs to consumers. Meanwhile, European companies that export industrial goods to the US are reconsidering their long-term strategies. Some are exploring setting up production facilities in North America to circumvent tariffs, but that transition is expensive and time-consuming. For example, German auto parts suppliers have hinted at expanding operations in Mexico or the southern United States if the trade war persists, but those moves could take years to materialize. Jobs and regional impact. The fallout from this dispute isn't just about prices, it's also about jobs. In the US, industries tied to European imports, such as retail, food service and logistics, could see job cuts as demand slows. A study from a non-partisan economic institute projects that up to 150,000 jobs could be at risk if the proposed tariffs remain in place for a year, with the auto sector bearing the brunt of the losses. Dealerships in particular are highly sensitive to sales fluctuations, and any drop in vehicle purchases could lead to layoffs. In Europe, the picture is equally bleak. France and Italy, whose economies rely heavily on agricultural and luxury exports, are at risk of losing thousands of jobs if the US market dries up. German auto manufacturers have already issued cautious warnings to their workforce about possible production cuts if demand from the US slows. In rural regions where vineyards and farms dominate local economies, the consequences could be severe, potentially triggering a wave of bankruptcies among small producers. Consumers forced to adapt. The ripple effect extends to consumer behavior. American shoppers are already adapting by switching to domestic wines from California or Washington State, or to cheeses from Wisconsin and Vermont. While these alternatives can soften the blow, they don't fully replace the unique qualities of European products. Auto buyers, too, may pivot toward domestic or Asian brands, which could benefit companies like Ford, Toyota, or Hyundai, but at the expense of consumer choice and variety. The bottom line is that the dispute is reshaping consumption patterns, forcing households and businesses alike to rethink their purchasing habits. What once felt like a distant political issue is now hitting wallets and altering everyday decisions, from what bottle of wine to bring home for dinner to which car to buy for the family. Behind the numbers and headlines, the real story of this US-EU trade standoff lies in the voices of people directly experiencing its ripple effects: small business owners, farmers, consumers, and industry workers. Their accounts reveal the anxiety and frustration simmering beneath the surface as both sides engage in a high-stakes game of economic brinkmanship. In New York's Upper West Side, Marco Alvarez, owner of a boutique wine shop, described how his regulars are reacting. A bottle of French Burgundy that sold for $45 last month is now $52. Customers notice that difference. Some walk in, pick up a bottle, and put it back when they see the price tag. We're not talking about luxury collectors here, just middle-class people who like good wine on the weekend. I can't keep explaining why the price is creeping up. It's exhausting. Marco has started sourcing more California Pinot Noirs, but even those domestic options are not immune to broader inflationary pressures. In Portland, Oregon, Julia Chen, co-owner of a small specialty grocery store, is facing tough decisions. Her shelves are filled with imported olive oils, chocolates, and cheeses, all of which are now caught in the tariff crossfire. We've been building relationships with small producers in Italy and France for years, Julia explained. Our customers come to us for authenticity, but I can't convince someone to pay $18 for olive oil that used to cost $12. If these tariffs go through, we might have to cut half our imports. It's heartbreaking because our store is about sharing culture, not just selling products. European producers are feeling the same pain. In Bordeaux, French vintner Yannick Fialip warned that US tariffs could devastate his business. We ship 40% of our wine to America. If tariffs jump to 30%, we will lose that market overnight. Americans will switch to domestic wine, and our bottles will sit in warehouses. People think big wineries can absorb this, but for smaller vineyards like ours, this could mean bankruptcy. His sentiment echoes across French agricultural communities where wine and cheese exports are lifelines for rural economies. Italian cheesemakers, too, are on edge. A producer in Parma noted, "We've already reduced our exports by 20% in anticipation of these tariffs. Parmigiano Reggiano is a global brand, but the US is a critical market for us. When people buy our cheese in New York or Chicago, they're tasting centuries of tradition. If we lose that connection, it's not just revenue, it's our cultural identity." Back in the US, car dealerships are bracing for an uncertain summer. In Columbus, Ohio, Tony Reyes, a manager at a European car dealership, shared his concerns. A 25% tariff was already tough to manage. If it goes to 30%, a lot of customers will simply walk away. They'll buy Japanese or domestic models instead. We're already seeing cancellations on pre-orders for German SUVs because people don't want to gamble on what the final price will be in August. If sales drop, I'll have to cut staff. That's the reality. The anxiety is shared by consumers who are quietly recalculating their budgets. Jennifer Brooks, a single mother from Austin, Texas, said she recently decided against buying a European hatchback she had been saving for. "I wanted something reliable, and I've always liked German cars, but the dealer told me the price could jump by a few $1,000s if tariffs go through. I can't take that risk. So, I'm looking at a used Toyota instead. It's not what I wanted, but I need to be practical." The frustration is also palpable among restaurant owners who rely on imported ingredients. In Boston, chef Antonio Russo, who runs a family-owned Italian restaurant, is already rewriting his menu. "We're cutting dishes that rely on imported mozzarella or truffle oil. The prices are just too high. Customers are already stretched thin. I don't want to raise menu prices, but if tariffs hit 30%, I'll have no choice. I'll either have to charge $30 for pasta or close my doors. Neither option feels fair." Meanwhile, across Europe, the sentiment toward Washington is hardening. European farmers and business owners are questioning whether they have become collateral damage in a larger geopolitical struggle. At a recent gathering of Italian wine producers, a common refrain was, "We don't want to be pawns in this game." The EU's Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič echoed this frustration during his trip to Washington, warning that the proposed tariffs could effectively eliminate EU-US trade in critical sectors. His comments reflect not just political rhetoric, but also the fears of countless European producers whose livelihoods depend on the American market. Even large corporations are feeling the strain. An executive from a German automaker, speaking anonymously, said, "We have invested billions in our US facilities and dealerships. Tariffs like these undermine that relationship. We're already considering shifting more production to Mexico or Canada, but that's not a short-term solution." The uncertainty makes planning nearly impossible. At the consumer level, the emotional toll of rising prices is as significant as the financial one. People are frustrated not just by the costs, but by the lack of clarity. "I feel like we're paying for a fight we didn't start," said David Morris, a father of two in Denver. "Whether it's wine, cheese, or a car, everything is getting more expensive, and nobody is explaining why in plain terms. It's just one more thing to worry about." These voices, from shop owners and farmers to consumers and executives, paint a vivid picture of how deeply interconnected global trade has become. A policy decision in Washington now reverberates across small French villages, Italian farms, and American suburbs. As the August deadline approaches, the anxiety is building. People on both sides of the Atlantic are watching closely, not because they want to debate trade theory, but because their livelihoods and daily choices are on the line. As the clock ticks toward the August 1st deadline, the outcome of this trade standoff remains uncertain, and the stakes are higher than ever. The latest negotiations between Washington and Brussels show signs of both progress and gridlock. On one hand, there have been signals that both sides want to avoid an all-out tariff war, aware of the damage it could inflict on businesses and consumers. On the other, neither side seems ready to concede on its core demands. The United States is insisting on broader market access and the removal of what it calls unfair EU trade barriers, while the European Union is determined to protect its agricultural and industrial exports from what it views as unilateral economic aggression. The reality is that no matter how these negotiations conclude, the effects will be felt for months or even years. Tariffs are not just numbers on paper. They change consumer habits, alter business plans, and shift supply chains. Even if a deal is reached at the last minute, importers and retailers will still need to account for the costs and uncertainty that have already disrupted their operations. For industries like wine, cheese, and automobiles, which depend on predictable pricing and reliable cross-border logistics, the damage may already be partly done. Contracts have been paused, shipments delayed, and long-standing supplier relationships are now under strain. Beyond the immediate impact on goods, this trade fight highlights a larger question about the future of global commerce. The US and EU have historically been allies when it comes to setting international trade standards, but this conflict underscores the fragility of that partnership. Both sides are facing pressure to prioritize domestic industries and voters over global cooperation. For the United States, tariffs are seen as a political tool that appeals to an electorate frustrated with decades of outsourcing and trade deficits. For the EU, pushing back against American tariffs has become a matter of defending its sovereignty and protecting the livelihoods of farmers and manufacturers across its member states. There is also the risk of a ripple effect beyond the US and EU. If this dispute escalates, it could embolden other trade partners, from China to Brazil, to take a more aggressive stance in their own negotiations. Global supply chains are already stretched thin due to post-pandemic logistics issues and inflationary pressures. An extended trade war between two of the world's largest economies could amplify those challenges, raising costs on everything from electronics to raw materials and affecting markets far beyond the Atlantic. Consumers are caught in the middle of this tug-of-war, and many are already adjusting their spending habits in anticipation of higher prices. The grocery store aisle, once filled with affordable European imports, could soon reflect a very different economic reality. A bottle of French wine that was once an occasional indulgence might become a luxury item reserved for special occasions. A mid-range German sedan that once symbolized reliability and status could be out of reach for middle-class families. These changes are not just about price, they are about perception. The feeling that the everyday cost of living is being reshaped by political battles far removed from daily life. Small businesses are especially vulnerable. A prolonged tariff regime could force many importers, restaurants, and specialty retailers to shutter or pivot entirely. For example, boutique shops that thrive on offering unique European goods might have to replace them with domestic alternatives, potentially losing the very identity that sets them apart. The same is true for European producers who rely heavily on the US market. For a small vineyard in Tuscany or a cheese farm in Normandy, losing access to American buyers isn't just a financial loss. It's a blow to generations of craftsmanship and cultural heritage. Meanwhile, larger corporations may weather the storm through diversification and global sourcing strategies, but not without passing additional costs onto consumers. Automakers, for instance, could shift some production to North America to avoid tariffs, but that transition is slow and costly. The result is a period of uncertainty in which both companies and consumers are left to navigate unpredictable pricing and supply chain bottlenecks. The open question is whether this standoff is simply another episode in a cycle of trade disputes, or a sign of a deeper realignment in transatlantic relations. Is this the beginning of a new era where economic nationalism overrides the long-standing partnership between the US and EU? Or will both sides recognize the mutual benefits of cooperation before lasting damage is done? Much depends on the willingness of leaders in Washington and Brussels to move beyond rhetoric and find common ground. As August approaches, consumers, businesses, and investors are holding their breath. Every day brings new headlines, new statements, and new speculation, but no clear resolution. What's at stake is more than just the cost of wine, cheese, or cars. It's the health of one of the world's most important economic relationships. Whether this dispute ends in compromise or confrontation, it will leave a mark on how Americans and Europeans think about trade, globalization, and their economic futures. For now, all we can do is watch and wait. Will the dinner table look different next month? Will car lots stand emptier as buyers hesitate? Will farmers in France and automakers in Germany find new markets, or will they hold out hope that the US remains their most reliable customer? These questions linger, and the answers will define not only the next season of trade, but perhaps the next decade of economic policy on both sides of the Atlantic. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. The US-EU trade fight isn't just another headline from Washington or Brussels. It's a slow-burning issue that could touch nearly every corner of daily life, from what we put on our dinner table to the cars we drive. Whether these next few weeks bring compromise or confrontation, one thing is clear. Global trade is no longer an abstract concept. It's personal, it's immediate, and it's shaping our wallets in real time. If you've started noticing prices creeping up on European goods, or if you've already felt the pinch, you're not alone. We'll continue to track how these negotiations unfold and what they mean for you, your family, and your local economy. Thank you for tuning in. Stay informed, stay prepared, and join us next time as we break down the stories that matter most to your financial future.